Today we are wrapping up a series that is exploring disability theology and inclusion. Over the past couple of weeks, we have looked at the call we have as a church to not only welcome disabled people, but to be a church where they can fully belong. Last Sunday, we talked about the core theological principle that since every human has been made in the image of God, those who are disabled do not need to be fixed or cured in order for us to see the image of the divine in them. They are children of God as much as anyone else is. And we are called not only to make space for them, but to create a place where their gifts, talents, and wisdom can help us to become the church God is calling us to be. One of the reasons we are focusing on this area of inclusion within our church is because disabilities impact so many people. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, 26% of the U.S. population has some kind of disability that impacts their daily life. For people 75 and older, that number jumps to almost 50%. From a numerical perspective alone, the issues around disability inclusion within the church are clearly important. But numbers aren't the only reason we need to be paying attention to this. We need to be paying attention to this because it's the kind of thing Jesus calls us to do. And there is no doubt in my mind that if Jesus was walking the earth today, he'd have a lot of things to say to churches about how important this is. After all, he was saying it while he was actually walking on the earth so long ago. According to the Gospel of Luke, Jesus was eating at a prominent religious leader's house, and a man was there who had some kind of disability. We aren't sure what it was. It just says his body was swollen in some way and that Jesus healed him. Since it was the Sabbath, there were some conversations about whether it was okay for Jesus to do that. In response, Jesus pointed out that if anyone there had a child or an animal that fell into a well on the Sabbath, they'd save its life. So of course it was okay to help any child of God who may be in need, no matter the day. Then Jesus took the lesson one step further by teaching them something about how we are supposed to create spaces of welcome and belonging for people who are often excluded by telling them, when you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers and sisters or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. A quick word before moving to the larger point here. The language used in that passage is not ideal. It identifies disabled people with some words we no longer use, and it makes assumptions about the ability of a disabled person to repay others that are no longer true. Things like this come up sometimes when we read Scripture. But I hope we won't let the words and assumptions from an ancient text written in a very different culture than ours overshadow a message that is still very relevant. Anytime we bring people together, Jesus calls us to make sure we are inviting those who are sometimes left off the invitation list. That's what this entire conversation regarding disability theology and inclusion is about. We've got to make sure that all of God's children are on the invite list. Not only that, but when they show up, they need to find a place where they can belong, where they can fully participate. For that to happen, there are some specific things we can do as a church and as individuals. First, we've got to make sure the physical space in which we invite people is safe and accessible. We talked about this some a couple of weeks ago, and I mentioned several aspects of our church building that don't meet that threshold. From entry doors that can't be opened automatically to inaccessible stage areas and even a baptismal that cannot be entered by people who aren't able to navigate stairs. These and other examples demonstrate an issue that is true with so many physical spaces in our society. The world is not fully accessible to people with disabilities, and there are so many places they cannot go and spaces they cannot be. And we need to be clear about something when it comes to that. While they may not be able to physically get somewhere, that does not mean they can't do the work that might normally happen there. I am confident that there are outstanding preachers and gifted musicians and singers who could add a lot to our experience of worship, but who can't get to the places in our sanctuary where their gifts and talents could be used to the glory of God. Unfortunately, when it comes to these realities, our society often expects the disabled person to adapt to the way things are, instead of doing what it would take to adapt our spaces to their needs. We've got to change that. And here at Middletown Christian, we are working hard to move in that direction. While we are at the very beginning of those efforts, our Imago Dei team is planning some intentional work toward this goal, including an assessment of our entire campus and its level of accessibility. They will also be exploring ways to make sure that our ministries and leadership structures are open and available to the disabled in our community. Their findings, as well as some recommendations, will be passed on to our church board for next steps. This process may take some time, but we are moving as quickly and as thoroughly as we can. Can you imagine what our church, what our world would look like if there were no barriers that prevent people with disabilities from living into their call? There is so much potential for expanded leadership, wisdom, and giftedness here, and I can't wait to see how God will work through us once we make it possible for more of God's children to fully participate in every facet of our ministries. While there are clearly some things we can improve upon as a whole church, there are also some things we can be doing as individuals to help create a church and a world where disabled people can find belonging. A good first step toward that would be to name something that might be hard to admit. And that's the fact that many of us are uncomfortable when it comes to being around or being in relationship with a disabled person. In fact, a survey done in 2018 revealed that 67% of the population is not comfortable talking to or with a disabled person. It's hard to create feelings of welcome and belonging with that level of discomfort. So let's start by offering ourselves a bit of grace, and then let's begin working toward getting over those feelings of discomfort so that we can confidently and lovingly build relationships with disabled people. I'm going to offer a few suggestions to those of you without disabilities that you might consider as you begin to practice that welcoming grace. Some of these are going to feel obvious and maybe a bit basic, but from what I have been reading and hearing from disabled people, these are real issues. First, talk directly to disabled people. Don't talk to a person with disabilities through any non-disabled people who might be with them. Talk directly to them. Recognize their presence in the same way you would recognize anyone else who approaches you. Second, talk normally. Don't talk slower or louder to a disabled person than you would to anyone else unless they first request that you do so. Until it happens, just talk like you usually do. Also, talk about normal things. The weather, Derby picks, U of L or UK, whatever you would talk to anyone else about is a great place to start. Third, don't touch their assistive devices or service animals. If a person is using a wheelchair, walker, cane, or other assistive device, that is an extension of their body. It is their personal space, and we need to honor that. And no matter how tempting it may be, if they have a service animal, do not pet them. They have a job to do, and they need to remain focused on that. Fourth, I encourage you to practice empathy, not sympathy. Empathy is shown in how much compassion and understanding we can give to someone else. Sympathy is more of a feeling of pity for them. Empathy allows us to grow in understanding of their journey and how they feel. Sympathy can come across as both distant and demeaning. Finally, don't be weird. Seriously, just be normal, or at least as normal as you can be. So if you are normally weird, use that as your baseline, and don't be extra weird. Now, there are certainly other things that could be added to this list, but I think it's a good start. And with practice, you will find a growing level of comfort with all of this. And once you do, I think you'll find that your life is going to open up to new relationships and encounters that are going to bring so many gifts and blessings. There are a couple of other things I want to mention that didn't fit on that list. but that we need to keep in mind as we seek to be more welcoming to disabled people. First, remember that while some disabilities are easy to identify or see, not all of them are. In fact, you may not be able to recognize that a person has a disability at all the first time you meet them. If that happens and you later learn about their disability, try not to respond with phrases like, "I would never have guessed that," or "You don't look like you have a disability." Instead, invite them to tell you more about their experience, and when they do, just listen and demonstrate respect and care for their words. The other thing I want to talk about is something I mentioned briefly last week, and that's the language we use when talking about the disabled community. For years, I was taught that when describing someone with a disability, it was best to use what is called people-first language. For example, a person with autism or a person with cerebral palsy. This approach is meant to honor that a person is more than just their disability, that they are not defined by the disability they have. Over the last year, I have learned that while some people in the disabled community still prefer people-first language, others have a very different take. In fact, both authors that I introduced to you last week do not like being addressed with people-first language. As a reminder, those books are My Body is Not a Prayer Request, Disability Justice in the Church by Amy Kinney, and Disability in the Church, A Vision for Diversity and Inclusion by Lamar Hardwick. At the very beginning of her book, Amy Kinney says the following about her take on this. Much ink has been spilled on whether we should use people-first language, quote-unquote people with disabilities, or identity-first language, quote-unquote disabled people, when talking about disability. I respect the various ways disabled people wish to be identified. Throughout this book, I use disabled people. For me, choosing this moniker is a way of shunning the shame often associated with disability and proclaiming that quote-unquote disability is not a bad word. I am not a euphemism or a metaphor. I am disabled. Her words are a good reminder that even within a community where people are experiencing something similar, they may have different preferences on how to talk about things. So it's just a good idea to ask or to listen to how they refer to themselves and then follow their example. Remember, this is not about our preference. It is about theirs. Our call is to help them feel like they belong, and if changing the words we use to describe them helps, that's a pretty easy thing for us to do. As I wrap up, let me give you the heads up on two things that are coming up soon. First, we have the first of two discussions in our upcoming series on disability in the church. They're scheduled on May 21st and June the 4th. The first discussion will be on children with disabilities, and the second will be about adults with disabilities. Our panelists will be from our church community, and I can't wait for these to take place. Second, today at noon, we are going to be sending out a survey via email that is meant to give our Imago Dei team a clearer picture of the individual diversity present in our church, as well as the bright spots and gaps that exist in the experiences and perceptions of our community members around belonging. This survey is not limited to disabilities. It covers all aspects of diversity in our church. If you are not on our email list, you can find the survey on our website. It is anonymous and will only take a few minutes to fill out. Thank you for taking the time to do that and for being the kind of church that takes the call of the gospel to welcome and love all of God's children so seriously. Amen.